Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 7th event in our public lecture series on the Wisconsin idea, past and present. This lecture series, as you know, is part of a new course that is being taught for the first time this fall under the auspices of the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name, as you know, is Chad Allen Goldberg. I'm a professor in the sociology department, and I have the honor to serve as the instructor for the course this semester. The Wisconsin idea has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society, the aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty in the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state of Wisconsin about how the knowledge produced at their university has benefited the public in the past and continues to do so today. I encourage you to participate actively through our course website, www.wiscidea.com, and our Facebook page. If you are live tweeting this or subsequent lectures, please use the hashtag #WiscIdea. The Sociology Department is offering this course with limited resources from our academic and supplies and expenses budget. If you would like to contribute to this project to allow us to offer real-time broadcasts or otherwise improve our offerings this semester or in the future, please consider making a contribution to the Department of Sociology Annual Fund. You can do that through the course website. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to remind you that the November 1st lecture by sociologist Matthew Desmond will be held at a special time and location, 7 o'clock p.m. at the Memorial Union, 800 Langdon Street, just down the street from the Pyle Center. I also want to remind you that for that event, tickets are required, and you can obtain those tickets for free from the Memorial Union ticket office. In addition, there will be an overflow room at the Memorial Union where people can watch a live video stream of the lecture. Now, we did want to ask folks who showed up tonight if you would like us to set up a second overflow room here at the Pyle Center, please raise your hand. I want to see how many people would be interested in doing that. Okay, so it looks like most of you will either go to the actual event or go to the overflow room in the Memorial Union. So we will not set up an overflow room here. Just remember to, on November 1st, to go to the Memorial Union. I see people saying that tickets are gone, so that means that only the overflow room, I guess, will be available for November 1st if you don't have a ticket yet. I should add that I believe that lecture on November 1st will be video recorded and posted on the internet, and we will provide a link to that on our website, the wiscidea.com website. Okay. To the business at hand. We are fortunate to continue our lecture series tonight with a lecture by Dr. Louis A. Friedland on Laboratory of Oligarchy. Like all of our speakers, he is graciously donating his time and expertise free of charge out of a commitment to public service. Lou Friedland is a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication and an affiliated professor in the Department of Sociology and the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he teaches and conducts research on the public sphere and civil society, the impact of new communication technology on society and community, social networks, community structure, civic and citizen journalism, international news reporting, public television, and qualitative and social network research methods. He is also the founder and director of the Center for Communication and Democracy. His publications include 4 books covering the world, International Television News Services, published in 1992, Civic Innovation in America, Community Empowerment, Public Policy, and the Movement for Civic Renewal with Carmen Siriani in 2001, Public Journalism, Past and Future, published in 2003, and the Civic Renewal Movement, also with Carmen Siriani in 2005. Professor Friedland's research has been supported by major foundations, including the Ford Foundation, Pew Charitable Trusts, the Knight Foundation, the Kettering Foundation, the Center for Information on Civic Learning and Engagement, and others. In addition to studying civil society, and public life. Professor Friedland is actively involved in the practice of civic engagement. He is the co-founder with Carmen Siriani of the Civic Practices Network, the first major website on civic renewal established in 1994. He is principal and managing partner of Community Knowledge Base, a community network software company which has won a contract with the U.S. Department of Education for developing civic mapping curricula and software for American high schools, and is developing the next generation of software for local newsrooms in partnership with the University of Missouri School of Journalism. He is a member of the advisory group creating a community information scorecard for the Knight Foundation, and he is a consultant for news and public affairs to Wisconsin Public Television. His documentary productions have won DuPont Columbia, Emmy, Society for Professional Journalists, and Corporation for Public Broadcasting Gold Awards. Please join me in welcoming Professor Louis A. Friedland.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you here tonight, and I want to thank you for coming. As I said to Professor Goldberg right before the lecture, I can easily see how you could vector off to the terrace on a night like this, and I can't swear to you I wouldn't have done it, but so I'm even more grateful that you're here. Now, I'm guessing that most of you here tonight are familiar with the phrase laboratories of democracy, derived from Justice Louis Brandeis's famous dissent in a 1932 Supreme Court case where he wrote, quote, "It is one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the country." He meant that states were free to experiment with social and economic policies that might benefit all of their citizens. If such policies succeeded, they could spread to other states. If they failed, the risk would be contained. The most famous and successful such laboratory in the 20th century was Wisconsin itself. Wisconsin politics in the late 19th and early 20th century was a unique hybrid of free soil republicanism that predated the Civil War, agrarian populism, Robert La Follette's progressivism, and the social democratic and labor traditions brought by Milwaukee's German immigrants. These streams mixed with the Wisconsin idea at the UW-Madison to develop a laboratory of democracy concerned with addressing problems of city and the country dweller, the worker and the farmer, to give rise to the farm labor tradition that still has deep roots in our state. Wisconsin created the first legislative reference bureau in 1901 to bring the drafting of law out from behind closed doors and into the public domain. In 1905, Wisconsin was the first to reform civil service and to reduce patronage and cronyism. We introduced the first independent commissions to regulate the railroads, setting a benchmark for the rest of the nation. In 1909, Wisconsin became the first state to continuously revise its statutes to make them more clear and accessible to average citizens. And not least, Wisconsin was the first state to adopt the corporate and individual income tax in a series of steps from 1905 to 1911, creating a model for the federal government in 1913. Today we face a new age of experimentation in our state, one that is dedicated to the explicit and systematic dismantling of the progressive reforms I've just enumerated. Many of us are likely familiar with the events of the past 6.5 years in Wisconsin, beginning with Act 10 in 2010, and I'll briefly return to that story shortly. But the major argument that I'm making today is that events in Wisconsin are not simply the result of a normal Republican state victory in that year. Rather, they are the fruit of years of experimentation and organization by ultra-wealthy individuals and organizations, both within and outside Wisconsin. In short, some states, ours most notably, have gone from being laboratories of democracy to laboratories of oligarchy. For the larger part of my intellectual life and career, and today still, I've believed in some variant of democratic and civic pluralism, which holds that there are multiple and competing centers for power in American life. These are reflected and organized through our party structure. These parties compete with each other through mobilizing both allied groups and public opinion. And through this competition, alternate groups exercise political power and shape policy. Sometimes Republicans win, sometimes Democrats, and they usually do so because they have convinced a majority of Americans or Wisconsinites at any given time that they are best able to solve their most vexing problems. I understand that this system embodies an asymmetry of resources that tremendously favors Republicans and conservatives, but mostly I believe that it works despite this. But this worldview is predicated on two things. First, there is a relative balance of power between the two parties. For the Democrats, the counterbalance to Republican money has historically been the labor movement. But as most of us know, the labor movement has shrunk to a shell of its former self, and its continuing stronghold, such as it is in the public sector. And this leads to a second consequence. Democratic pluralism requires that both parties accept the consequences of winning and losing. And this is certainly something that's in the news today, as it well should be. But as Norman Ornstein and Robert Mann have argued in It's Worse Than It Looks, the Republican Party has adopted a stance of permanent opposition to both government and governance, the idea that any problems can be solved through government action. At the federal level, this has resulted in the corrosive stasis between a Republican Congress and a Democratic president. Now, to understand whether these two conditions have shifted the political terrain fundamentally, I need to explain what I and others mean by oligarchy and ask whether this is a hyperbolic term or really applies to the contemporary United States. Next, I will move to the case of the state of Wisconsin as an epicenter of the movement towards the transformation of state policy and politics in a direction that favors the ultra-wealthy. Finally, I will ask, what about our politics and public opinion makes this shift possible in a state that is still, by objective standards of majority voting in presidential election years and public opinion on key issues like support for schools, unions, and moderate gun control, a moderate, slightly left of center state, purple-leaning blue in the current parlance? I realize that many, if not most, of my arguments remain suggestive rather than dispositive. What I'm about to present to you is part of a larger work in progress, part of which has been undertaken with colleagues. And I'm not presenting our findings here tonight, well, a few of them, but the initial framing of one part of our project, which is a study of the political and civic ecology of the state of Wisconsin. This will be one of the first truly statewide studies that has taken place, looking at politics, civil society, and communication in a single state. But I do need to stress that my colleagues are not responsible for the analysis I'm offering today, this evening. It's my own, although the last section on public opinion does incorporate my interpretation of our joint work. So, pardon me. I realize that the use of the term oligarchy may strike you as hyperbolic. Honestly, when I first thought of it as a turn on the phrase laboratories of democracy, it struck me as hyperbolic too. I just liked the way it sounded, to be honest. But as I began to investigate the structure of growing inequality of wealth in the U.S., and by now this is largely an accepted fact, it took on greater plausibility. Now, I'm about to tell you some things. I'm going to try to condense them. I think many of the people in this room are familiar with them. The wealth gap in the United States has been growing since at least the mid-1970s. I don't have time to discuss its sources and reasons, but without being technical, there are three. The first is economic, the beginning of the decline of the rate of growth around 1975. The second is a series of political decisions, beginning with Ronald Reagan, to shift the tax burden from the wealthiest Americans downward, from the wealthiest strata to the middle classes. The third, and closely related, is what Hacker and Pearson have called the Great Risk Shift. As the share of wealth going to government declines, the social safety net has begun to unravel. Put simply, we live in a highly unequal society, and inequality appears to be getting worse. Inequality has reached the highest rate since the 1920s. Larger and larger fractions of wealth are controlled by increasingly smaller fractions of the wealthy. The popular meme labels this upper group the 1%, and indeed, the share of the 1% follows a general curve. But the starkest divisions take place within the top 1%. This slide that I hope I will about to show you, this is just a general chart of income inequality since the 20s. And you can see that it takes the shape of that U-shaped curve, getting back to where it was in about 1929. But this is the slide that I really want to show you. This shows the difference in the average income between the 1%, which is down here. This is the top 1%, this flat line. I don't seem to have a pointer. This flat line at the bottom is the top 1%. So you saw the rate that income inequality is increasing in general in the United States, and we talk about the 1% being at the top of that scale, but it's not the 1%. The 1% has increased, but barely. The top 0.1%, which is the top 10th of 1%, or the top 1,000th of the population, controls almost 25% of income and wealth. And these, I need to say, these are average incomes. These aren't percentages of wealth that I'm showing you. So it's pretty clear that this stratum is wealthier. The top 0.1% is very wealthy. But this, of course, does not mean, and I want to stress that it is per se an oligarchy. But we see the next gap between the top 1% and the top 10th of 1%, representing the top 10,000th of the population, and the 100th of 1% representing the top 10,000th of the population. This is the group here that we might call the super wealthy, that part of the class that might form an oligarchy. Now, there's widespread agreement on this rising wealth gap, even including among many conservative economists and commentators, although, of course, there are some dissenters and significant disagreement over causes, consequences, trajectory, and remedies. But for tonight, I'm simply going to take this as a straightforward premise. Inequality has reached new heights and is increasingly concentrated in smaller fractions of the super wealthy. Our immediate concern here tonight is what this means for politics. In traditional research and political commentary, the effect of the super wealthy on politics is usually relegated to the margins. The conventional wisdom goes that both sides of the political spectrum are tied into the super wealthy, and indeed they are. They both raise huge sums of money for campaigns, and in the average campaign, they cancel each other out. And I want to stress that in a, quote, a normal campaign, I'm going to leave it to your imagination what the word normal means. But in a normal campaign where we have Mitt Romney against Barack Obama, relatively, certainly in retrospect, a relatively normal Republican, against a normal Democrat, they do cancel each other out. They both raise large sums of money. They both have very similar ground games in the states. They both have similar media campaigns. They both have similar databases. But more recently, a group of political scientists, including Larry Bartels of Vanderbilt, Martin Gillens of Princeton, and Ben Page and Jeffrey Winters of Northwestern, has contested that claim. In a series of articles and books, they've elaborated the argument that groups of the super wealthy, first, have qualitatively different preferences than the rest of us, and that includes the merely wealthy down towards the bottom of the scale here, those folks who only make between $5 and $10 million a year. Second, and I realize that saying that the super wealthy have different preferences than the rest of us is sort of understating the case, but second, that they actively intervene in politics to realize these preferences. And third, in the case of Page and Winters, that they form a type of oligarchy. Now, what does that mean? And I'm going to focus for the next few minutes on what I mean by oligarchy, because the precise meaning of this is very important, I think, and whether this is really plausible or not. The traditional Aristotelian definition of an oligarchy, ruled by the few, is pithy, but it doesn't get us very far. Much of my argument is drawn from Page and Winters, who authored a joint article in 2009, which Winters expanded into a 2011 book entitled, surprisingly enough, Oligarchy, from Cambridge University Press. The book ranges across history, finds 4 forms of oligarchy, and it's somewhat more complex than we have time for tonight. But the premises are relatively straightforward. Winters characterizes the modern U.S. as a civil oligarchy, meaning that the primary interest of this exceedingly small stratum of the super wealthy, the top 10,000th and 10,000th, is in defending their wealth. Now again, I realize that it's not likely to shock most of you in this audience, but nonetheless, I want to pick that apart for a moment and see what that actually means. So this is just a quick quote from a Winters Oligarchy. In civil oligarchies, where existing property and fortunes are secure, no matter the scale of wealth or the degree of stratification within a given society, oligarchs for the first time devote virtually all of their material power resources to the political challenges of income defense. So I'll leave that for a second. And I want to stress 2 things about this definition. First, in Winters' theory and in other theories of oligarchy, oligarchs have ruled through violence. They've ruled through force. They've ruled through direct intervention. They've ruled through control of the military and so on. In a civil oligarchy, oligarchs do not rule through violence or force. Rather, and second of all, they are primarily concerned with the defense of their income, not with power per se. Winters contrasts civil oligarchy with traditional theories of elites, in which a group, network, cabal, class, or fraction of a class determines political and policy outcomes through self-directed manipulation of the political process from above and or behind the scenes. In contrast, civil oligarchs are those who can substitute money for political mobilization to achieve their ends. But, and this is most important again, the central end of civil oligarchy is the preservation of wealth, or as he calls it, wealth defense. This in turn requires 2 things. First, a secure private property regime in which, though its parameters are fought over, essentially has been a central part of the United States since its founding. We do not have a confiscatory political system, although some conservatives have argued that we do. Second of all, property and wealth is secure. Second, the elevation of minimal taxation to the central goal of public policy. And I want to stress that. The elevation of minimal taxation to the central goal of public policy. Other things being equal, we can see super wealthy on the aiding environmental causes, donating to many different parts of the political spectrum, and so on. The central goal of this class, or this group, fraction of a class, I should say, is the minimization of taxation. More simply, wealth begets wealth, and the wealthy do everything they can to keep as much of it as possible through low taxes. Now, a wealth defense industry arises to accomplish this income defense through a variety of normal means. The first is the structuring of tax policy and the tax code to minimize taxation on the highest incomes in the first place. The second is to ensure that the tax code is both complex and porous, and to defend the army of wealth managers, develop the army of wealth managers, lawyers, accountants, and lobbyists to both defend the larger structure of taxation and, equally important, to make sure that special privileges and positions are regularly written into legislation. The third, of course, is that once tax law is written, the wealth defense industry makes sure that as much individual income is sheltered as possible. Now, it's critical to realize much of this can go on in a very, and almost entirely uncoordinated way. There doesn't need to be any billionaires club meeting to coordinate tax policy. And for Winters, this in fact constitutes the normal functioning of a civil oligarchy. But beyond the basic structuring and normal operation of the rules, It is political power that makes sure the rules stay favorable to this tiny minority. And this has historically been accomplished through contributions to the Republican Party and its allies and PACs, although bets are often hedged, and certainly Democrats have also been recipients of major contributions. Finally, I believe there's a third front beyond wealth, defense, and normal politics, not adequately emphasized by winners, but addressed by political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, among others, in their winner-take-all politics. And this is the interest of the super wealthy in creating a system of governance in which social welfare is kept to a minimum. Put simply, education and healthcare are adequately funded. Social security is secure. When education and healthcare are adequately funded and Social Security is secure, and when we consider expanding child care subsidies and family leave, the money to do so has to come from taxes, which puts the wealthy and super wealthy, to the extent that preservation of wealth is their highest priority, in a conflict with those who would benefit. Further, there's a well-established correlation between the degree of unionization in society and the degree of social provision. Stronger unions mean that more of these social goods are likely to be provided, and they are likely to be more secure. As many of us know, private sector union membership has been in decline in the U.S. since the 1950s, hitting a 97-year low of 6.6 in 2013. The remaining bulwark of unionism is government workers and teachers. To the extent that the wealthy see a zero-sum game between social provision and the preservation of wealth through lower taxes, lowering or even removing union membership and power is a priority. However, there is a major roadblock to the shrinking provision at the federal level. First, cutting some social provision remains remarkably unpopular, as the continuing attempts to privatize Social Security have demonstrated. Further, the Republican path to the presidency has become increasingly difficult, though by no means blocked, making achievement of the unitary federal power necessary to enact sweeping changes, rolling back social provision, unlikely. There are structural roadblocks presented also by the so-called emerging Democratic majority as America moves towards becoming a nation of pluralities around 2045. So this is the context in which the super wealthy have turned to the states as a focus of political wealth coalition initiatives and defense. Richard Nixon, some of you in the audience may remember him, coined the phrase the new federalism to describe the devolution of funding and welfare to the states. This is a story about a different kind of new federalism, a national network of the ultra-wealthy built and paid for by Charles and David Koch and the Wisconsin-based Bradley Foundation, among others, whose goal, as I've said, is to turn the states into laboratories for the repeal of the New Deal and the progressive era. First, let's briefly consider why the states are so important. In the first place, states set the legal framework for much of U.S. property law. They determine the scope of regulation of corporations, the environment and natural resources, for criminal justice and incarceration, for policy and spending on health and social welfare and education. State courts can frame legal doctrine that often leads to new federal legal decisions, particularly in these areas. Second, the states offer much greater opportunity for political control, particularly mid-sized and smaller states, where outside money can be much more effective because of the smaller size of media markets and the cost of elections. Research by Hurdle Fernandez and Scotch Poll at Harvard has demonstrated that liberal efforts at state policy intervention are a pale shadow of their conservative counterparts, like ALEC and the Bradley-funded State Policy Network, not to mention the Koch-funded Americans for Prosperity. Finally, and less understood, I think this is quite poorly understood in many ways, there's a built-in bias towards rural, exurban, and suburban districts in state legislative districting, which results in an ongoing conservative political skew in the states. Now, liberals largely see this as a result of intentional gerrymandering, the manipulation of boundaries to favor one party over another. And this does go on, of course. David Daley's recent book, Rat Effed, I cannot say it, makes clear that this has occurred. But recent work on unintentional gerrymandering by Chen and Rodden finds that because of the concentration of Democratic voters in urban districts, pro-Republican bias can be quite pronounced even in the absence of intentional gerrymandering, an average of 5% in the 20 states that they studied. So this is the, I'm going to say natural, or the result of the actual population concentration of Democrats in the cities and the distribution of Republicans or conservatives in rural and exurban areas. Of course, when this is combined with intentional gerrymandering and efforts to suppress minority voting, as we've seen in Wisconsin and North Carolina, among other places, overturned by the Supreme Court recently, the conservative skew is even more severe. The ideology of states' rights as a bulwark against federal change predates the Civil War and has been the major form of resistance to civil rights since Reconstruction. But a network of super wealthy, ultra-conservative, and libertarian donors and organizations began to turn its organizational attention to the states as laboratories for social experiment and radical corporate and environmental deregulation, ending or stripping social welfare programs, privatizing schools, and decertifying unions as early as the 1960s. This network is vast and it's complex, with a series of interlocking networks that Jane Meyer has dubbed the Coctopus. And I strongly urge all of you to read Meyer's excellent book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right. It's a great piece of investigative journalism. It's worthy of a full lecture and more. And I know that many of you here tonight heard Lisa Graves present the work of the nonprofit Center for Media and Democracy, headquartered here in Madison. Under her leadership and a group of researchers, Mary Batari among others, the story of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, has been well told and made public, and I urge you to go to their website for more information. I'm not going to repeat it here tonight. They are experts in this area. I am not. Other major sources include the Center for Public Integrity and the Center for Responsive Politics. And most of what I have to say in the following section rests on their work and a few other scholars, including Scotchpole and Hurdle Hernandez. So let's briefly outline the states as laboratories of oligarchy, the strategy, and the major actors. There are three groups central to the ultra-conservative success in the states. The first is probably quite familiar to you, centered around Charles and David Koch. Individually, each brother is worth about $40 billion, which would tie them individually for ninth on the Forbes wealthiest list. Bill Gates is first at $75 billion. But taken together, their fortune exceeds his, and their giving is highly coordinated. Their central organization is Americans for Prosperity, which is fueled by their own wealth and their Freedom Partner seminars. These twice yearly seminars have up to 500 attendees who pay a minimum of $100,000 to attend. So for those of you who are counting or math challenged, as I sometimes am, that's $50 million minimum per pop. Many people pay more than that, so that's $50 million twice a year plus. Politicians jostle to audition for this audience of current and future funders, including our own Paul Ryan and Scott Walker and Mitch McConnell. But this is the really, in some ways, the more important part, I think, less understood. The network also includes the Freedom Partners Chamber of Commerce, an alternative business organization as parallel to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Libre Initiative, targeted at Latinos. Generation Opportunity, targeting millennials. And Themis I360, an age of strategic big data, which develops big data and campaign organizations. Scotchpole and Hurdle Fernandez estimate that 76% of all of the budgets of right-wing organizations created since 2002 are controlled by the Koch network. 76% since 2002. And 4/5 of new money raised by extra-party funders flows through Koch-affiliated consortia. So that's roughly 80% of all the new money on the conservative right flows through these consortia. Or these consortia, I should say, and others affiliated with the Kochs. Washington Post journalist Philip Bump, and I think quite rightly, has dubbed the Americans for Prosperity America's third largest political party. And really they are, in many ways, a shadow party organization. I don't say shadow in a pejorative sense necessarily, but literally they are a formation of a party within the Republican Party. They're designed to parallel and overlap the Republican Party. They're state directors paid by Americans for Prosperity, AFP, and by 2010 they were present in 34 states, encompassing 4/5 of the United States population. All but 8 states are targeted for expansion this year. AFP directors raise local money, coordinate grassroots groups, and pressure legislators and public officials. In some states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, they're closely intertwined with ultra-wealthy networks. The second leg of the state policy apparatus is ALEC, which I know many of you probably are familiar with. Began in 1970 as a 501c3 educational organization, but has since largely functioned as a lobbying group. ALEC has produced thousands of new bills, of which hundreds have become state laws. ALEC has about 300 businesses and trade networks as paid affiliates, but also around 2,000 state legislators who attend conferences where they're briefed on model bills, which they then bring home, introduce, and often pass with virtually no modification, while often working at the same time to disguise their origins. ALEC has been actively supported by the Kochs and the Koch network, including significant loans over the years. More interesting and probably less known to many of us is the third element of this state policy apparatus, the State Policy Network, a coalition of conservative state-based think tanks, which was founded in 1992 by a South Carolina anti-union magnate, Thomas Rowe. But the State Policy Network produces coordinated policy papers with state branding. In fact, many of the ideas are actually centrally coordinated and disseminated. By 2011, the State Policy Network's budget was $83 million. It's a lot of money. In 2012, there were 64 separate State Policy Network think tanks, at least one in every state, coordinating with Americans for Prosperity, the Cato Foundation, and the Heritage Foundation, all of which receive Koch funding. In 2009, the State Policy Network added an investigative news service, put that in quotes, partnered with the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity with, quote, news bureaus in 40 states. Franklin's founder, Jason Sferak, told a conservative conference that the organization planned to fill the vacuum in state-level media across the United States. The State Policy Network received major funding from the Milwaukee-based Bradley Foundation, which I'll return to shortly. And finally, we need to at least mention the Club for Growth, a national organization founded to promote a free market, free trade, anti-regulation agenda, also with state affiliates, including a very powerful Wisconsin Club for Growth. Now, so far, we have a working definition of civil oligarchy, a sense of why the states might be laboratories for those seeking to institute wealth-defending policies, and a sketch of a few of the major actors. Again, I assume that many of you here tonight are familiar with the major actors and events that have occurred in Wisconsin since 2010. If you're not, I strongly recommend the book by Jason Stein and Patrick Marley of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, More Than They Bargained For, which is the most complete and even-handed account of the events. And some of my specific references to those events are drawn from there, from the work of the Center for Media and Democracy and other newspaper sources, particularly an important report on the Bradley Foundation published in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in 2011 by Bice, Glauber, and Poston. I'm not going to discuss the Guardian's publication of the John Doe papers tonight. I hope some of you are familiar with that. I'm just going to suggest how Wisconsin worked as one such laboratory of oligarchs. By the mid-2000s, this network of ultra-conservative and libertarian donors I've described was actively seeking to move its policy agenda forward. As I've noted, the Bradley Foundation was a central actor in this overall agenda, both nationally and in Wisconsin. Although probably most of us know of the Bradley Foundation, we may not understand how large and influential it is in the political wealth defense network. The Bradley Foundation has more than $600 million in assets. As we can see here, not very well, but the top is the Kochs, the middle is the Scaife, and the bottom is the Bradley Foundation. The Bradley Foundation has dispersed almost $365 million, a third of $1 billion, since 2001, more than the other two major conservative funders, Koch and Scaife combined. So this is our home state foundation. Although this excludes both PAC contributions and, of course, dark money, so it may be much higher than that. Bradley has been the leading backer of privatizing schools through vouchers and charters, spending more than $16 million on that effort. It was a backer of so-called welfare reform, and both of these efforts took hold in the 1990s under Governor Tommy Thompson. It's been a major promoter of efforts to cut back and even kill public unions, of right to work, and not surprisingly, the deregulation of campaign finance laws. Bradley has funded 3 ultra-conservative websites in Wisconsin, including the McIver Institute, a member of the State Policy Network, which editorialized for the end of public unions in Wisconsin just 2 weeks before Governor Walker proposed Act 10. McIver and the Koch's Americans for Prosperity Foundation spent $1 million on TV ads supporting Walker's budget proposals. Another Bradley-supported site was, quote, Teachers Union Exposed. Bradley helped found the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, a leading think tank, which hired then conservative radio talker Charlie Sykes as the editor of its magazine, Wisconsin Interest. While still president of Bradley, Michael Grebe chaired Governor Walker's 2010 campaign, chaired his transition team, and chaired the 2011 fight against his recall, sending out a fundraising letter asking supporters to help Walker combat, quote, the Democrats and big government union bosses. As a former chairman and CEO of Milwaukee-based Foley and Lardner, he was well positioned as a fundraiser. It's important to remember, and I think most of us probably, again, do know this, that Governor Walker never mentioned his plan for dismantling public unions during the 2010 election. Although ALEC advanced model legislation for eliminating unions, and Mary Bottari of the Center for Media and Democracy argues that ALEC influenced Walker, who was a member of that group, there's no clear evidence that it was pushed by ALEC. Powerful Republican lawmaker Robin Vos was a state co-chair for ALEC, but he called Act 10, quote, happenstance, because of the complete Republican takeover of state government. But in the framework that we're discussing tonight, that powerful network of wealth-defending oligarchs, foundations, and funded publicists, the precise source of the idea is less relevant. Americans for Prosperity have been actively pushing to curtail or destroy public unions in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, as well as Wisconsin. The Koch brothers, PAC, gave $43,000 to Governor Walker directly, and $1 million to the Republican Governors Association, which ran ads for Walker. AFP organized rallies and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on ads. Bradley had given AFP $600,000, and the McIver Institute and AFP spent more than $1 million to defend Walker's policies. So the results, as they say, are history. I want to, in the final part of this talk, and believe me, there is a final part. This is a classic trick in sermons for those of you who go to religious congregations. In concluding, but it never really does. I want to turn briefly in conclusion to the contentious politics of our state. There are 3 elements that help understand how Wisconsin went from a state with a relatively civil, if sometimes contentious politics in the mid-1990s to being one of the most polarized states in the Union. The first is a fairly straightforward question of what constitutes normal politics. The second concerns the changed media environment in the state. And the third asks what happens when division is used as an explicit political tool. Wisconsin is considered a purple state, but it has a relatively consistent electoral pattern. It has voted for the Democratic candidate in every presidential election year since 1988. But during non-presidential years, the electorate skews older, whiter, and more Republican. For instance, in the last 5 years, Wisconsin has voted into office Democratic-Republican president, we're not back in the Federalist era, Democratic President Barack Obama in both 2008 and 2012. Tea Party favorite, Republican Senator Ron Johnson in 2010, conservative Republican Governor Scott Walker in 2010, and liberal government and first openly gay Senator Tammy Baldwin in 2012. Today, however, Wisconsin is a national example of contentious, polarized politics. This leaves a gaping question for students of civil society and public opinion. Did the state's underlying politics simply shift so quickly to become the ideal state of the Koch-Bradley-Walker coalition, or is something else at work? In politics, I believe, this super wealthy coalition's destruction of its opposition was the fuse for contemporary polarization. It was not a natural occurrence. There's some evidence for this in the framing of the Walker victory against the unions. As UW political science professor Kathy Kramer has demonstrated in The Politics of Resentment, a great book, must read for every Wisconsin citizen, there was a wellspring of resentment in Wisconsin's rural areas, towns, and smaller cities against teachers, government workers, and UW-Madison professors in particular. This existed before the Walker victory. These rural-urban differences were certainly present before Walker, but the Wealth Coalition successfully used them. Several respondents in interviews I've conducted on state politics with one of my colleagues reported that during the recall election of 2011, the Republican Party sent letters out to voters in outstate counties naming teachers in their neighborhoods and their salaries. While this remains anecdotal, although it's been we've multiple sourced it, it suggests the level of vituperative tactic that was deployed to demonize public workers systematically and throughout the state. Another contributor to the sudden shift in climate is the continual decay of the state's media environment. Newspapers are the central originating source, and I can't stress this enough, of information about state government. They are the fount of virtually all original reporting about state budgets, policies, and conflicts of interest. While there are a number of television stations and reporters that do good original reporting, on the whole, newspapers are the beating heart of public accountability. What is happening to them in Wisconsin, as in the U.S. as a whole, is not good. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel has long been an anchoring hub of state opinion, and the journal was separate until 1995. The journal's circulation declined by 100,000 between 2000 and 2010 to about a little over 160,000 today. At the same time, newspaper ownership shifted out to out-of-state corporations, particularly the Gannett Corporation, the largest chain in the nation, which culminated its Wisconsin expansion this year with the acquisition of 14 newspapers in all of our largest cities, save Madison, including the state's Pulitzer Prize-winning flagship, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. The most important effect of this is the decline of regular State House reporting. Across the U.S., the number of State House reporters has declined 35% since 2003. 35% since 2003, from just under 500 to about 300. So if you're counting, that's about 6 per state. It's not evenly distributed, but it's about 6 per state. A lot more in California, which means many fewer in other states. Published estimates of Wisconsin State House reporters range from 7 in 2009 to 19 in 2014, but it's almost certainly on the lower side. Despite the emergence of new forms of State House reporting like WisPolitics and Wisconsin Eye, these are specialized outlets used primarily by political insiders and lobbyists. The Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism is the only fully independent, in-depth investigative outlet in the state, but it depends on partners for distribution, including these newspapers that Gannett just bought. Overall, the amount of regular daily news reporting of coverage of state government has declined significantly in the last decade. And what's replaced it? Equally important, for the most part, talk radio, which is closely associated with ultra-conservatism. Two of Wisconsin's largest and most powerful radio stations, WTMJ and WISN, have essentially been turned into right-wing talk radio outlets since the 1990s. The most important talker is undoubtedly Charlie Sykes, who has been one of Governor Walker's most active promoters and who, as noted, edits the Bradley-funded Wisconsin Interest. Finally, the rise of social media has arguably increased, or at least mirrored, the broader polarization of the state. In that study I mentioned that we are conducting of statewide Twitter, we find almost perfect polarization between conservatives and liberals, with news outlets occasionally bridging the two, but the bridges are most often being used to showcase the errors of the other side. By no means has social media bridged the partisan gap left by the shrinking of newspapers. To conclude, and this time I do mean it, in a democracy, people are free to associate with others, to aggressively pursue their views, and to contest for power politically. When one party wins control, it is free to pass the program that it ran on, even if, and almost certainly when, the opposition doesn't like it. That's American politics. What is new in Wisconsin and in other states like Kansas, North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana is that a small group of ultra-wealthy donors and allied foundations have funded a parallel party network dedicated to destroying their opposition and rolling back basic social provision in the service of protecting their tremendous wealth and privilege. These states are the new laboratories of oligarchy. I wish I could end this talk on a more positive note of democratic optimism, but there are no simple answers. I can only return to the beginning, back to Justice Brandeis, who said, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Thank you very much.